Christmas night 1944. A farmhouse command post near Bras, 9 miles southwest of a town most of his men had never heard of 3 weeks earlier. General Major Heinz Kockott sits with a field lamp and a report he does not want to write. Outside, the temperature is well below freezing, and somewhere across the frozen fields to the northeast, the wrecks of 17 German tanks are still burning at Hemmerl, throwing orange light against the snow. Kockott commands the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. 6 hours ago, he believed this night would end with Bastogne in German hands. Now he takes his pen and writes the sentence that will outlive every promise made to him by Berlin. Of continuing the attack with what remains of his division, he writes that it would be irresponsible and no longer feasible. That is not a defeated man's despair. Kockott was, by every account of the men who fought beside him and against him, one of the steadiest officers in the Ardennes, a veteran of the Eastern Front, a Knight's Cross holder, a commander American interrogators would later describe as scholarly, dignified, a man who never raised his voice. When a soldier like that puts down in his own hand that the fight is no longer feasible, it is worth asking what he saw in the 4 days before he wrote it. This is not the version of Bastogne that ends with one American general's one-word joke to surrender ultimatum. That story is true, and it is famous, and it is also only the opening paragraph. The fuller account, the one that comes from the German side of the line, from interrogation transcripts, captured battle reports, and the German commander's own post-war reconstruction of what went wrong, is colder, slower, and considerably more damning of the plan they arrived with. To understand why Kockott's sentence carries the weight it does, you have to understand who was writing it. He was not a political appointee or a hastily promoted reservist. Born in 1900 in Upper Silesia, he had spent the war climbing through infantry commands, a regiment on the Eastern Front, a Knight's Cross awarded in March of 1943 for his leadership of Grenadier Regiment 337, a training command back home before he was handed the 26th Volksgrenadier Division in the late summer of 1944. He had seen Soviet artillery and Soviet winters. He was, in the estimate of the American officers who later sat across the table from him, a natural optimist, a man inclined to believe the plan would work even when the evidence in front of him argued otherwise. That matters because it means the account that follows is not the testimony of a man looking for excuses. It is the testimony of a man who wanted very badly to win, and who watched, position by position, village by village, as a numerically inferior American force made that impossible. The unit he was fighting had existed at that point for a little over 2 years. The 101st Airborne Division was activated on the 15th of August, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, built in large part around cadre pulled from the 82nd. Its first commander, Major General William C. Lee, gave the division's men a line that would follow the unit through the rest of the war and beyond it. The 101st had no history, he told them, but it had a rendezvous with destiny. It was, at the moment Lee said it, a strange thing to tell a division of draftees and volunteers training in the Louisiana heat, with barely a third of the equipment they would eventually carry into combat. Airborne doctrine itself was barely proven. American planners were still arguing in 1942 over whether large formations of lightly armed men dropped behind enemy lines could survive contact with anything heavier than infantry, let alone armor. Lee's answer was to build a division around initiative rather than equipment. Junior officers and sergeants trained to keep fighting with whatever men and ammunition they had on hand if radios failed and command chains broke, because in an airborne operation, command chains were expected to break. It was a doctrine built for chaos. Bastogne would test whether a doctrine built for a few hours of chaos after a jump could hold for a week of chaos in a siege. Lee would not live to lead them into that rendezvous. A heart attack grounded him before D-Day, and Major General Maxwell Taylor took command in his place. The division Lee had built jumped into Normandy in June of 1944, sustaining casualties that ran close to a third of its jump strength in the opening weeks, then fought through Holland that September in Operation Market Garden, where it held a corridor of road for Montgomery's stalled offensive for over 2 months of grinding, unglamorous defensive fighting. By the time trucks rolled the division toward Bastogne in the 3rd week of December, the 101st had a combat record in the offense and in mobile defense, but almost no experience holding a fixed, encircled perimeter against concentrated armor. That, as it turned out, was exactly the test history had prepared for them, and neither side yet knew how the doctrine would hold up. The German offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge began before dawn on the 16th of December, 1944, when 3 German armies struck the thinly held American line in the Ardennes forest. On the southern shoulder of that attack, General Heinrich von Leutwitz's XLVII Panzer Corps, the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, and Kockott's 26th Volksgrenadier, tore through the American 28th Division's positions along the Our and Clerf rivers. Kockott's own division took Clervaux by the 17th, and by the 18th the road to Bastogne lay open in front of them, defended by little more than scattered rearguards of the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions. It should have been over quickly. Bastogne was a road junction, not a fortress, and the forces racing toward it from Bastogne's own garrison were still arriving piecemeal, truck by truck, through the night of the 18th and into the 19th. By the 20th of December, elements of the 101st Airborne trucked in from Reims, still recovering from Holland. Some men without proper winter boots, some without enough ammunition to fill their belts, had taken up positions around the town's perimeter. Von Leutwitz's original plan called for Panzer-Lehr to bypass Bastogne entirely and press for the Meuse River, leaving the town's reduction to Cocot's division alone. It was meant to be an economy of force problem, solved with one reinforced Volksgrenadier division against what the Germans believed to be a rapidly collapsing garrison. Cocot's own division history states plainly that the troops entered the attack with high morale, confident in their strength and in the promise of home front industry and air support behind them. By the 21st, his division had closed the ring completely, sealing off Bastogne's roads in an encirclement roughly 8 kilometers across. 2 days of near stalemate followed, the Germans consolidating their positions, the Americans inside doing the same, an eerie quiet before the event most people associate with this battle. On the morning of the 22nd, Major Wagner of the 47th Panzer Corps and Lieutenant Helmuth Henk of Panzer-Lehr's operations staff, under a white flag, approached the American line south of Bastogne, where they were met first by Private First Class Leo Palma, a Browning automatic rifle gunner with F Company 327th Glider Infantry. Palma was 21 years old that December, one of 14,000 American soldiers. Inside a perimeter, the Germans had them outnumbered in roughly 5 to 1. He watched 4 German soldiers walk toward his foxhole waving white flags, 2 officers in long overcoats and polished black boots that looked, in his own later description, almost absurdly clean against the churned mud and snow of the front line. Word spread down the American positions within minutes that the enemy had had enough and was giving up. The rumor was wrong in every particular, but it tells you something about how confident the men holding that line already felt, 2 days into an encirclement that should, by any conventional military logic, have crushed their morale entirely. The German officers delivered a written ultimatum promising, in essence, total annihilation of the garrison unless it surrendered within 2 hours, along with a warning about serious civilian casualties the artillery barrage would supposedly cause. It was carried up the chain to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st in Major General Maxwell Taylor's absence. According to the men in the room, McAuliffe's first reaction to the demand could not be printed in any newspaper. When his staff pressed him for a formal reply, one of his officers, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, reminded him of the word he'd already used. McAuliffe had it typed and sent back down the line. The reply read in full to the German commander, Nuts, the American commander. An American intelligence summary written months later after the German surrender would characterize the German response to that reply with a certain dry irony of its own, noting that the anticipated bombardment, the one meant to turn the snow red, never came anywhere close to living up to its billing. Here is the detail almost never mentioned in the retelling. The ultimatum itself was never authorized by the German High Command. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, von Leutwitz's superior, stated flatly after the war that he had not ordered it and did not know, even years later, exactly who had. Von Leutwitz had drafted and sent it on his own initiative, apparently believing the defenders were bluffing with their aggression and could be talked out of the town rather than blasted out of it. It was, by his own superior's later account, a serious misjudgment of the American position, and Cocot and Bayerlein, the Panzer-Lehr commander, were both privately convinced from the start that the bluff would fail. They understood something about the men across the line that von Leutwitz, sitting further back at Corps headquarters, apparently did not yet grasp. That understanding deepened as December wore on. The Americans inside Bastogne were, by any conventional measure, in a desperate position, outnumbered roughly 5 to 1, short of ammunition, short of winter gear, cut off from resupply, and enduring nightly Luftwaffe bombing runs on the town itself. And yet the record the Germans themselves kept does not describe a demoralized garrison. It describes a defense that got harder to break the longer it went on. A captured German soldier's letter home from that week, one of dozens recovered by American intelligence, put it plainly. The snow, he wrote to his wife, must turn red with American blood because victory had never felt closer. Confidence like that, expressed just days before Christmas, tells you the German rank and file believed the outcome was settled. What Cocot's own after-action record shows is how quickly that confidence collided with a defense that simply refused the script. Consider the story of Captain Wallace A. Swanson, commanding a company of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment at the village of Champs, one of 2 small farming towns Cocot would target in his climactic Christmas Day assault. Swanson was a company commander, not a household name, one of thousands of American captains scattered across the European theater that winter. On the night of the 24th into the 25th, Roughly 50 German infantrymen from the 77th Volksgrenadier Regiment, wearing white snow camouflage that made them nearly invisible against the drifts, infiltrated into the northern edge of Champs itself. House-to-house fighting broke out in the dark, in cellars, in barns, in kitchens that had been Belgian farm families' homes 3 weeks before. Swanson held. Reinforcements from B Company 1st Battalion were rushed in under Major John Hanlon to close the gap. Accounts differ slightly on exactly how many Germans were killed or captured inside the village that night, but every version agrees on the outcome. Champs did not fall. Between the ultimatum and that Christmas assault came another kind of test entirely, not combat, but survival. By the 23rd of December, the weather that had grounded Allied aircraft for days finally broke, the fog lifting into a clear, hard blue sky. From bases in England and France, 241 C-47 transports of the 53rd and 60th Troop Carrier Wings lifted off and flew straight for the half-mile square of frozen ground the 101st still held, dropping 144 tons of ammunition, food, and medical supplies by parachute directly into the perimeter. Many of the air crews flying those runs had carried the same paratroopers into Normandy 6 months earlier and made the run by their own account because they wanted to help their friends a second time. Ground troops recovered roughly 95% of what was dropped. Cockott himself watched the sky fill with parachutes from his own lines, and for a confused moment believed he was watching American reinforcements landing rather than supplies, a misreading that briefly rattled his own attacking troops before the truth became clear. It was this resupply, arriving just 1 day before his planned Christmas attack, that gave the garrison the ammunition to make that attack fail. The second prong of Cockott's Christmas attack struck at Hemmerl, where tanks of the newly arrived 115th Panzergrenadier Regiment were meant to punch through the American line and drive straight into Bastogne itself, while the infantry cleared Champs behind them. It was, in Cockott's own planning, the 1-2 blow meant to end the siege before Allied air power returned with the dawn. He needed his forces inside Bastogne by 9 in the morning. Any later, he knew, an American and British aircraft would begin working the roads. The tanks did not make it. American gunners and bazooka teams from the 327th Glider Infantry, dug in around Hemmerl, destroyed the Panzer column in the pre-dawn dark. Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuz's regimental staff, working the phones from their command post through the small hours, tracked the collapse of the German attack village by village as it happened. By morning, 17 German tanks lay wrecked and burning in the snow-covered fields, hit, in the words of one American officer who walked the ground afterward, so many times by so many different weapons that it was impossible to say which shot had actually stopped them. Cockott called off the attack that same afternoon. It was in the aftermath of that failure, his division decimated, his timetable broken, the one attack he had built his Christmas around lying in wreckage, that he sat down and wrote the sentence that opened this account. Continuing the attack, he recorded, would be irresponsible and unfeasible. There is a document worth pausing on here, because it captures something the tank wrecks and battle reports cannot. An American Army surgeon working near the perimeter that week kept his own observations of the wounded passing through his aid station, German casualties beside American ones. He was struck, he wrote, by the tenacity to life the American boys showed, by how little they complained, how completely they trusted the men treating them, how they accepted pain without protest and made no claim on comforts as though they were owed anything at all. It is a small, almost domestic detail buried inside a much larger catastrophe, a broken hand quietly splinted, a young private waving off morphine so the next man could have it first, but it is exactly the kind of detail that made its way unofficially into the German assessment of what they were fighting. An army that does not panic under artillery, does not break under encirclement, and does not complain under a surgeon's knife, is an army whose morale calculations do not work the way the German planning assumed they would. That miscalculation shows up again in a smaller, almost comic exchange, recorded during the post-war interrogations that would eventually produce most of what we know about the German side of Bastogne. In November and December of 1945, the 3 senior German commanders from the operation, von Leutwitz, Bayerlein, and Cockott, sat down together with American historian S.L.A. Marshall to reconstruct the battle in detail, checking their memories against the American operational record for accuracy. Also present was Colonel Harry Kinnard, the same officer who had suggested the word nuts to McAuliffe, who had served as the 101st's operations officer throughout the siege. The German commanders were visibly startled to learn who he was. Von Leutwitz pressed the interpreters more than once for confirmation. Was this young, boyish-faced officer truly the man who had run operations for the entire division against them, or had he perhaps commanded only a single regiment? It seemed to men who had spent careers assuming rank and gravity moved together, faintly impossible that the officer responsible for organizing their opponent's defense across an entire siege could be this unassuming. Of the three, Marshall's account singles out Cockott as the most careful and objective witness, a man who, even a year later, was still trying to understand exactly where the plan had gone wrong rather than simply blaming his subordinates for it. What the German record ultimately concedes, across Cockott's diary, Maniful's post-war statements and Bayerlein's own recollections, is not that the Americans in Bastogne fought without fear or without loss. They did not. What it concedes is a pattern: infantry, armor, and artillery that worked together at Bastogne in a way the attacking Volksgrenadier and Panzer formations, thrown together from different commands with little time to train alongside one another, simply could not match. Manchiful himself, reflecting after the war on the broader withdrawal fighting that had slowed his advance in the first place, admitted that the American delaying action across those opening days had on the whole succeeded, an assessment from the one man in the German chain of command, with the clearest view of how badly the original timetable had unraveled. The siege broke finally on the 26th of December, when lead elements of Patton's Third Army, driving north in a punishing four-day forced march that turned an entire Army Corps 90 degrees off its previous axis of advance, reached the southern edge of Bastogne's perimeter. The 101st was not pulled off the line even then. The division stayed in place through much of January, grinding down what remained of the German salient alongside Patton's tanks. By the 25th of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was, for all practical purposes, over, and the German army that had launched it would never again mount an offensive of that scale in the West. Cockott's own war ended in April of 1945 when he was captured by American forces. He spent 2 years in Allied custody before his release in 1947, and what followed was, by every surviving account, an unremarkable post-war life: no memoir tour, no public reckoning, no dramatic reinvention. He died in May of 1976 in Siegsdorf, in the Bavarian countryside, 75 years old, largely unknown outside the small circle of historians who had spent those November and December sessions in 1945 working through his memory of the fighting map by map. What survives of him publicly is almost entirely that testimony, the interrogation transcripts, the battle reports, the sentence he wrote on Christmas night with his division bleeding out in the snow around Hemmerl. He did not intend to leave behind a tribute to the men who defeated him. He intended to leave behind an honest account of why his attack had failed, written for his own superiors, in his own hand, before the war was even over. That honesty is precisely what makes it worth more than any post-war boast could have been. It is worth saying plainly what this account does and does not claim. It does not claim that Bastogne's defenders were undefeatable or that the battle was ever a foregone conclusion. It was not, and men on both sides paid for that uncertainty in the coldest days of a brutal winter. What it claims is narrower and, in its way, more interesting: that the clearest evidence for how well the 101st Airborne and its attached units fought at Bastogne does not come from the American press releases or the victory parades that followed. It comes from the enemy's own paperwork, from a shy, methodical division commander who had every institutional incentive to blame bad luck, bad terrain, bad timing, anything but the men across the line from him, and who instead wrote in the coldest language available to a soldier that the attack could not go on. There is a version of this story that ends with one word: nuts, and lets the audience leave satisfied, as if defiance alone won a siege. It is a good word, and it was, by every account, genuinely said, genuinely meant, and genuinely followed by 4 more days of fighting that decided nothing on its own. The truer ending is quieter and slower. It is a German general, on a night 3 days after that word was spoken, sitting with a lamp and a report, admitting in ink that irresponsible was now the only honest word left for the plan he had arrived with. Bastogne did not break Cockott's confidence because the Americans shouted louder. It broke because, position after position, night after night, the defense simply did not do what exhausted, outnumbered, poorly supplied garrison was supposed to do. It did not fold. It held Champs. It held Hemmerl. It held, and it kept holding until the men who had come to break it were the ones left writing down for history exactly how and why they could not. That is the testimony this account rests on, not because the American story needs a German signature to be true, but because when the men sent to defeat you are the ones who end up explaining in their own words why they failed, the record they leave behind is the hardest kind of proof there is. Cockott never set out to write a tribute. He set out on a cold farmhouse night to explain a failure to superiors who had demanded a victory. He explained it honestly, and in doing so he left behind something no American press release from that Christmas could have produced on its own: an enemy's plain, unembellished account of exactly where his plan met a defense that would not move. 80 years on, the word most people remember from Bastogne is still the one McAuliffe wrote on a scrap of paper, but the word worth remembering just as well is the one Cockott chose 3 nights later alone, when there was no one left to perform for irresponsible. It was the closest a defeated general could come, in his own hand, to admitting that the men across the line from him had simply been better than the plan had allowed for.